Okay, I will get started with the introduction as participants are still coming in. First of all, my name is Till Ehrmann. I am campaigner for Finance Watch, and I lead our work on fiscal policy. I will moderate you through today's event. You won't hear too much from me. My colleague Ludovic Suttor-Sorel will guide you through most of today's content. But I'm here for the in-between parts. This meeting today is recorded and live streamed, just for your information. You will be able to ask questions after each bigger block of content, and we will also have a question and answer session at the end. Feel free to write questions at the Q&A section of Zoom, or raise your hand after we ask for questions and I can unmute you, and you can also speak directly. Please try to be precise and short in your questions so that everybody has time to ask one. With this workshop today, we're coming to the end of a series of 3 workshops that we had as part of the broader Fiscal Matters week of debate. On Monday, we had already an introduction to fiscal policy. Then yesterday, we followed up with the EU fiscal framework, myths and opportunities. And today, we're rounding up the series with a workshop on how to reform the European fiscal framework. And this brings our week almost towards the end. I would just like you to inform that please register for today's final closing event at 5 p.m. today. We have Joseph Stieglitz and Marco Buti joining, so I think it will be really worth coming. So if you haven't done so, visit fiscalmatters.eu and register for the closing session tonight. While we're still fresh and have all our attention, I would like to start with a little poll to see how our participants, how much you know actually about the fiscal framework, and it would help us knowing a little bit about what your level of knowledge is and how deep we can go. So I'm just going to launch a poll now, which I'll give you some minutes to answer, and we'll share the results very soon. You should see it popping up on your screen or at the bottom in Zoom where you can answer it. Now I will hand over to my colleague Ludovic Suttor-Sorel, which will guide you through most of today's content. Very great to have you here, and please enjoy this workshop. Ludovic, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Till. First of all, good morning, everyone. Happy to see so many of you this morning. So we are going to discuss how to reform the European fiscal framework, but in this workshop is going to be based on 3 reports we published at Finance Watch. The first one framework tool demo, which is about 5 questions on the European fiscal framework to dig a bit on what it is, what are the main issues, and what are the main options potentially to reform the fiscal framework. The second one is Navigating the Maze, which is a guide we did on how to reform the European economic governance. It's more about the legislation, what are the different blocks, and how and what are the procedures to reform the framework. And the last one was Fiscal Mythology Unmasked, debunking 8 tales about European public debt and fiscal rules. And here the idea is that we think that the fiscal framework and also the difficulty we have to reform it is based on the fact that it relies on some fiscal myths that are really well ingrained in the mind of almost all of us. So we wanted to debunk 8 of them. So today we're going to discuss 5 points. 4 really on the EU fiscal framework, but first I really wanted to, before digging on what is the EU fiscal framework, on what are the main legislative blocks, on what's wrong with the fiscal framework and how to reform the framework, just wanted to quickly go back to the first question, which is the name of our week of action and debates, which is why fiscal matters. So obviously when you're thinking about fiscal, about public finance, we could speak for an hour on why it's important, how it complements private finance, how it's different, how it's working. But here I will just ensure that you have 2 facts in mind while going through this whole webinar workshop. The first one is the existence of an annual funding gap, which in Europe has been estimated by the Commission last year at around 700 billion, which basically mean that it's money we still have to find to fund different objectives we have. A large part is about is what we call the green funding gap. It's a part on renewable energy. It's a part of the money we still have to find to finance what we need to do in construction, in transport, in environmental protection, in resource management, in circular economy. It has been estimated at around 450 billion per year until 2030 if Europe wants to reach its own environmental objective. To that, you have to add the cost of the digital transformation, the twin transition, the strategic investment, and also the spending that still need to be done to avoid declining public capital stock, which mean the social infrastructure and the public infrastructure in general. On this annual funding gap, which is important to understand, is that yes, a part will be bridged by private finance, but just a part. You can't expect the 700 billion to be funded by private finance, even though we have many liquidity and we have enough money out there to fund this. Just to give you an example, a recent study of McKinsey called Net Zero Europe shown that 60% of the necessary investment to be done before 2030 to transition to a net zero Europe do not have a viable business case. What does that mean? Is that we know that we have to do this investment, but they are not profitable enough to be credibly expected to be funded privately. Therefore, we have to acknowledge that for that we will have to unlock public finance, otherwise we won't succeed in breaching this green funding gap. It's an important point to keep in mind. And the same logic can be done for other type of investment that has to be done in the end by the public. The second point is related to the first one, is the building up of new type of risk. The one that we're going to discuss is the climate risk. And for the climate risk, before taking a look at the graph in itself, we all have heard about the climate-related financial risk. So basically, it's the impact that climate change could have on financial stability and on bank, on a financial institution. It's well known, well developed, many reports, many discussion, many legislation trying to discuss that on the prudential regulation. There are discussions about capital requirement directive or to integrate this climate-related financial risk. But for the moment, we don't have enough understanding and discussion about another concept, which is climate-related fiscal risk. Basically, it's the idea that in the end, a part of climate change, a part of the cost to transition, the cost to mitigate climate change, but also, the cost of extreme weather event will have to be borne by the public budget in the end. So, for the first time, in UK, the Office for Budget Responsibility, which advises the government and give recommendation on budgetary forecast, has tried to estimate the size of this climate-related fiscal risk for the UK. They run different scenarios of climate action that could be done or not, and in function of these, they are showing that, for example, in the case of an early action scenario, climate change could have an impact of plus 20% debt to GDP ratio by 2050. And in the case of a late action scenario, it could have an impact of plus 45% of debt to GDP by 2050. Here, what's really important to keep in mind is that it's really a difficult exercise. We have many issues with climate change. It's notably the fact that there are a certain amount of radical uncertainty. You can't really be sure on what's going to the world look like, what's going to be the problem you will face if we cross a climate tipping point. We don't really know what will be the situation in a world of plus 4 degrees Celsius and what will be for different parts of Europe. So obviously this type of exercises, it's useful to understand and to start thinking about the fact that climate change will have an impact in the end on debt sustainability, but acknowledge that it's if we have to do this type of exercise, it will always have to be understood as a probabilistic exercise conducted under uncertainty. So new risk and existence of funding gap, it's two excellent reasons to discuss fiscal and to see why it matters. So, as I tell before, we can't expect private finance to bridge the EU annual funding gap. We'll have to unlock public finance too. It's why we think this week of action and this debate were necessary. So, first point. Okay. Till, yes, we had the result of the poll, and okay, good for me to know. During this workshop, I will try to be as clear as possible. It won't be possible to go into each and every detail, so sorry for the expert. In some cases, it might be frustrating, but we will have the Q&A session, and you can always send me an email, and we can take coffee if you want to discuss in detail some of the points we're raising. Thank you, Till. So the first point, the framework. What is the EU fiscal framework? So here's a bit of an introduction. So it's basically a set of rules constraining EU member state fiscal policy and mostly their budget. Why has it been created? It was to reduce contagion risk in what was going to become an incomplete European monetary union, where there was some sort of lack of trust between a country with different attitude toward money, toward public debt, and we had to find, or they wanted to find, some common rule that were first the convergence criteria and then become later the Maastricht criteria. It's a long debate on why it's an incomplete EMU. We could discuss the lack of monetary backstop, the central fiscal capacity, but we'll probably go a bit beyond the point of this workshop at this stage. So just to recall, the main numerical fiscal rules that are at the core of the EU fiscal framework are first the debt rule. So the debt rule is the idea that debt has to be below 60% of the GDP of the country. The deficit rule, which states that the deficit has to remain below 3% of the GDP, and what has been added in 2005, the structural deficit rule, that states that the structural deficit, which is the part of the deficit which is not related to the economic cycle, so to make it into words, part of spending a state could have is, for example, during a crisis, you have to spend more for unemployment benefits. This part, this is what we call the automatic stabilizer, won't be counted in the structural deficit rule, in the structural deficit, but will be counted in the deficit. It's different between both. So for the structural deficit rule, it's 0.5 to 1% of the GDP. These rules are really intertwined, so the fiscal framework, with the European semester, which is a yearly process, a part of the three-pillar system of European economic governance. So by this three-pillar, we mean this one. So nowadays, we are going the Commission is going to relaunch the process, the public consultation to review the European economic governance, not just the EU fiscal rule. So it's important to understand how that the European fiscal rule, the fiscal framework, the fiscal surveillance pillar is a part of a bigger system. So the first pillar, fiscal surveillance, is basically, as you know, in this pillar, member states has to submit their budgetary plan to the European Commission. The European Commission assess the compliance with the European fiscal rule. In case of non-compliance with this rule, the Council can launch an excessive deficit procedure towards states, and it can, in the end, lead potentially to sanction, even though it never happened, for pretty good reason. So a part of this pillar, you have obviously the excessive deficit procedure, the Stability Growth Pact, the TCG, Fiscal Compact, etc. We're going to go into detail on this part a bit later. But just to recall, the two other pillars is the second one is the macroeconomic surveillance pillar. In this pillar, the European Commission monitor the build-up of macroeconomic imbalances that has been created after the Euro crisis, to monitor what's happening in different member states and to avoid having any surprise on some macroeconomic development, and also to try to prevent this type of excessive macroeconomic imbalances. It has a procedure, the macroeconomic imbalance procedure, which is related to this pillar. The third pillar is the socio-economic coordination. So as part of the yearly policy coordination cycle named the European semester, member states coordinate fiscal, so it's what we said about the pillar 1, employment, but also economic policy. In the framework of this European semester, you have different steps where the member states interact with the Commission, with each other, to the Council, where the Parliament give opinion. The Commission analyze the situation of each country in national report. They made country-specific recommendation. Member states submit each year the fiscal plan, but also economic policy reform plan, what we call the national reform plan. And all of this is part of this process called the European semester. Today, we are going to focus mainly on the first pillar, almost only on the first pillar, even though the three of them have some interrelation that are also interesting to understand. So I won't dig into detail, but this is basically the timeline of the European semester process that basically start, we can say in October, by when member states present their draft budgetary plan for the euro area member states, and that draft or the type of plan anyway. Or in November, when the European Commission published the autumn package with the annual sustainable growth survey. And as you can see, there are many interactions between member states, Council, Commission, and the Parliament. So this was really a broad introduction. The idea was that you keep in mind the three pillars, that we're going to focus on the first one. Now we are going to try to navigate what we call at Finance Watch the maze, and to discuss what are the main legislative blocks of this European fiscal framework. So, in the past report, we dig into each regulation, directive, article of the European Treaty, Intergovernmental Treaty, which was about this European economic governance. It's our report Navigating the Maze that we'll send you a bit later. Here, we don't really have the time, and a workshop's not the right type of format for that. So we won't dig into every detail. I just want you to keep in mind that this EU fiscal framework is basically grounded in primary legislation, which are the article of European Treaty, such for example as the Article 126, which has been added in the Maastricht Treaty. Is the article about the excessive deficit procedure. It basically states that member states shall avoid excessive deficit, which are defined as crossing reference values. It also states that the European Commission will examine member states' compliance with this obligation. And in case of non-compliance, the European Commission will prepare a report and make recommendation to the Council. It's complemented by the protocol number 12, which is also annexed to the European Treaty, which define the reference value we just mentioned. So it's the famous 3% deficit to GDP and 60% debt to GDP. And it's really important for you to understand that these are inside the European Treaty and can't be easily changed. So if you have to make a recommendation on how to reform, it's probably better to focus on the second part, which is the secondary legislation, which is about regulation and directive. Same here, we won't dig into each and every detail, but happy to discuss a bit later. So the first most important piece of legislation, of secondary legislation of this European fiscal framework is what is called the Stability Growth Pact, which has two arms, the preventive arm and the corrective arm. In the preventive arm, you will find what is called the medium-term objective that member state has to state for themselves, which is basically an objective on how to reach balance or in surplus budget. This information, but also the adjustment path towards this objective, is put in what is called the stability or the convergence, in case of non-euro area country, the stability program or the convergence program. That will be sent to the Commission. So in this text, you will find the detail on this program. The corrective arm defined the excessive deficit timeline, but also the sanction in case of excessive deficit. It also defined other things like the unusual event clause that allow to suspend some part of the fiscal rule in case of a crisis. It's a bit different from the general escape clause that has been invoked for the COVID crisis, but is the same type of spirit. It's important for you to know that the Stability Growth Pact has been amended in 2005. Basically, we realized that it was a bit too pro-cyclical, that it forced a spending cut, whatever the economical cycle, that it was really an issue when you have a financial crisis or economic crisis. And therefore, we decided to build and to add to the framework a structural deficit rule that I discuss a bit sooner. But also we added minimum adjustment paths toward the structural deficit rule, but also other elements of flexibility. For example, structural reform clause that says that in case of some structural reform, member states can receive some leeway to go beyond the 3% limit or the limit of the structural deficit rule. Later, you add other reform of the Stability Growth Pact in 2011, 2013 as part of the 2-pack and the 6-pack package. One of the most important elements that you have to keep in mind is that we added a debt reduction benchmark, which basically states that when a country debt is beyond 60% debt to GDP, this country has to reduce its stock of debt by 1/20th per year each year until it reaches 60%. The third part of this fiscal framework, it's an intergovernmental treaty, which is the TCG, in which the Title 3 Fiscal Compact require member states to include a tighter structural deficit rule in their own national legal framework, preferably their constitution, but also an automatic correction mechanism. So it makes even more complex the discussion about how to reform the fiscal rule, because some country has followed the example of Germany and have included in their own constitution a sort of debt break structural deficit rule. So here it's another way to present the same, but so just keep in mind that we have primary legislation, secondary legislation, intergovernmental treaty, but also extra-legislative and interpretative document, which, for example, is the case of the Code of Conduct related to the Stability Growth Pact, which is a document of 200 pages that gives detail on how to understand different parts of the EU fiscal framework, what to do, guidelines on the format and content of your draft budgetary plan or your stability and convergence program. Also detail on the flexibility, how to really interpret it, what has been put in the Stability Growth Pact. But also you have documents on how to calculate output gap, so basically how to assess where your economy is in the economic cycle, which can have an impact on the structural deficit rule. Today we are going to focus mostly on these two elements, the secondary legislation and the extra legislative interpretative document. In this, we believe that a reform that would target everything will likely fail, will be difficult, but we think that some of these elements are more important than others, but we will discuss this at a later stage in this workshop. If you want to have more detail on this maze and the different elements, feel free to download or navigating the maze, and you will have 20 pages on the topic. So I don't know if you have any question at this stage or not. Okay, I don't see any. And not till if you have no question, I will move to the next session.
Let's move on to the next part then. Feel free to post your questions also in the Q&A during Ludovic's presentation. Yeah, but Ludovic, let's move on.
Perfect. So, the problems. What's wrong with our EU fiscal framework? So, in the recent year, many criticism has been done on the EU fiscal framework, and has been criticized for being, first, insufficiently responsive, to the context. Second, indifferent to the spending quality, not just the quantity, but the quality. It has been criticized for being blind to environmental and social concern. It has been also criticized for being asymmetric and to be overly complex. So I will try to guide you through these different criticisms. So the first one, the fact that it's insufficiently responsive to the context. So as we already discussed before, in 2005, because we had some procyclicality concern, the fact that when you have economic crisis, the fiscal framework, Stability Growth Pact, still put pressure on yourself not to run any deficit and to cut your spending. And therefore, we decided to create a structural deficit rule to try to fix this problem. But meanwhile, this new rule, structural deficit rule, came on top of the general deficit rule of 3%, not instead of. So many persons are saying that, this makes the fiscal framework even tighter, while bringing a raft of measurement issue. Basically, it's really difficult to know precisely where you are in an economic cycle. There are some equation and long economic debates on how to calculate output gap where you are in the economic cycle. And it has created some tension because a change in the way you calculate output gap can have a strong impact on what a member state can do and on the fact that it can or not run more deficit. So yeah, this structural deficit rule is really under a lot of criticism nowadays. And the Commission has some proposal, for at least the European Fiscal Board has some proposal on how to change the structural deficit rule. In the fiscal framework, we also had at the point different escape clause, the unusual event escape clause and the general escape clause. The general escape clause basically states that when you have an economic crisis that hit the euro, the European Union, some part of the fiscal rules can be put on ice. So, for example, the excessive deficit procedure, normally the Commission can't really launch an excessive deficit procedure when the general escape clause is activated. But still, it's only useful in some case, and it doesn't allow to take everything into account. The second point, the second criticism, is the fact that the EU fiscal framework would be indifferent to spending quality. So it's known for constraining the quantity of spending, but really doesn't really look into the quality of spending. So basically, what the spending is made for, what are the objective? Is it a spending for, I don't know, environmental protection for school, or is it a reckless spending? So in the framework, you have the debt protection benchmark that states that you have to reduce by 1/20% your debt in excess of 60% each time every year. And in absence of any concern for the spending quality, in the absence of any special treatment, for example, for investment, it incentivizes undifferentiated reduction of government spending. And it has had an impact on the public investment level in Europe, as it is often politically easily to cut investment in new projects than to reduce spending, for example, in a wage of a teacher. Some flexibility has been added in the European fiscal framework for investment, but also for structural reform. But the problem with that is that the conditions are far too restrictive, which means that for these two rules taken all together, a member state can only have a leeway of 0.75% of GDP, so less than 1 point of GDP per year. There are other conditions, but just only this one can already make you understand why the investment clause is not sufficient to allow Europe to bridge the green funding gap. It's why we have some proposal and discussion about creating a green golden rule that would exclude climate-related investment and spending. It leads me to the third point, the fact that the framework is blind to environmental and social concern. So it's not totally true, just because the European semester has evolved recently by the fact that the Commission added the monitoring of social trends and environmental trends. So first it was the social scoreboard with some information on on unemployment, on level of needs and different other social factors. And the fact that recently the European Commission also added a monitoring of the SDGs in the country report made by the Commission. But it's only monitoring. It's so these environmental social concerns are still secondary to fiscal. And why? Because fiscal and macroeconomic surveillance, so the pillar 1 and 2, they have binding procedure. So when the Commission make a country-specific recommendation, I don't know, to France, to Germany, to Italy, to reduce its excessive deficit, it's backed by the excessive deficit procedure. So there is it make this country-specific recommendation binding, but it's not the case for a socio-economic or environmental recommendation, because in some case, when the Commission recommends to country, for example, to shift the tax burden from labor to environmental taxation, it has no legal basis to do so. So member state basically, in general, does not really follow the country specific condition made by the Commission. Meanwhile, these environmental and social concerns are important in the discussion about the EU fiscal framework and the European economic governance, because environmental and social sustainability are interconnected with long-term fiscal sustainability. As we have discussed in introduction, we now start to understand the existence of climate-related fiscal risk. The fact that climate change, if it's not mitigated, will have an impact in the long run on the stock of debt of each and every European country in each and every country in the world, and could therefore, if not mitigated well, have an impact on the long-term debt sustainability. So if you acknowledge that it's an important issue which is not only to be dealt by environmental minister, but also by economic and financial minister, you acknowledge that it has to have a stronger role in the European economic governance and the European fiscal framework. Another criticism that has been made to the European fiscal framework is that it's asymmetric, which means in the sense that the European fiscal framework can constrain deficit, can launch an excessive deficit procedure and force a country to reduce deficit, and you can force spending cut, therefore, but the fiscal framework is not equipped to force spending increase. In some cases, some European countries have a really excessive commercial surplus and a comfortable budgetary position, and they can decide just to keep this money aside or to just reduce debt stock and not to invest it. In some cases, it can create a downward spiral, reduce EU aggregate demands, and create deflationary pressure. And to fight this type of trends, we have no tool currently to fight this. And the last one is the fact that the framework is said to be overly complex. It's more than 10 regulation directives, several articles of the European Treaty, Annex Protocol. And there are always been in this EU fiscal framework tension between three principles: simplicity, adaptability, and enforceability. And it's true that in some cases, this additional complexity was needed to better adapt this EU fiscal framework to economic cycle, for the example of structural deficit rule. So if you want to go more into detail, you can go into, you can download our one framework to rule them all. There are more detail on all of this criticism. Do you have any question?
We have a question from Isabel in the chat. Isabel, would you like to ask your question directly? I'm happy to give you the to unmute you for this.
Okay, I can try, but I'm in a very noisy place. Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay.
So my question, Ludovic, was on the first part of your presentation on automatic stabilizers. I'm not sure I well understood, but I believe you said they are excluded from the 3% deficit calculation, and another numerical rule applies to them. I was wondering whether you could confirm that and say whether it's then still problematic with this third numerical rule, or if these spendings, which are mostly social spending, if I well understand, then are somehow allowed with enough flexibility. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabel. Yes, I maybe haven't been clear enough on this one. It's not excluded from the deficit rule, it's excluded from the structural deficit rule. The structural deficit rule doesn't look into your level of spending for unemployment benefit and this sort of thing. They are sort of excluded because it just rely on where you are on the economic cycle, which is not the case for the deficit rule, which is still an upper limit. Is there another question? Okay, we'll move to the rest. So last part, the navigation, how to reform the European fiscal framework. So before digging into the how, we wanted to briefly present, but really briefly, the idea of fiscal meat, just because we really think that what makes very difficult to reform the European fiscal framework, and also what explain some of its pitfalls, is a series of fiscal myths that are really common in Europe. So with the report on this one, there was 8 myths, and just want to quote and to see this one. The first myth is the idea that when public debt exceeds 100% of GDP, it becomes unsustainable. We could have chosen 60%, 90%, but it's basically the idea that there would be an ideal debt to GDP threshold, and if you're below, it's okay. You have absolutely no risk of debt sustainability, and if you're beyond this one, you have an issue and your debt is unsustainable. So it's the first myth we debunked. The second one is the idea that when inflation returns, interest rate will rise and debt will become unsustainable as a consequence. We heard that many times these past months. The third one is the idea that public debt would be an unfair burden on future generation, where we think that it's the lack of future-oriented investment which is really a burden nowadays. Another myth is the idea that public budgets, like those of healthy households, must stay in surplus. It's what we call the household analogy fallacy. And we discussed all of this yesterday, so we can send you the link of the workshop if you want to dig a bit more into, and the report at a later stage. And the last two was the idea that numerical fiscal rules set economically sound limit to contract deficit bias of politicians. In this myth, we show that the 60% debt to GDP ratio has no economic ground. It was just the average of the EU public debt back in the day when it has been decided, and same for the 3% was just usage it was just in use in France back in the day. And the last one is the idea that EU fiscal rules don't need reform; they are flexible enough to take in economic, environmental, and social factor, which we think is not true. I will just here discuss one myth, and then we'll move to the core of the discussion, how to reform. One myth is the idea that when public debt exceeds 1% of GDP, it becomes unsustainable. So this is, on this graph, you can see the level of debt to GDP ratio of many countries. The EU countries are in blue, and in red and purple is the other country. As you can see, Japan has 256% debt to GDP ratio, while Ukraine has 50%. What's interesting to keep in mind is that Japan has absolutely no issue to service its debts with a so high level. There's no risk, and no one thinks that there is a risk for Japan to have an issue to service its debt, while Ukraine in the 1992, if I remember well, has to restructure and has to basically default on a stock of debt of 40% of its own GDP. What we just want to plant the seed in your mind is that there are no real proper debt to GDP threshold that can really, there are no magical number that can ensure that your debt is sustainable. There are other factors, but if it's not the stock, which factor determine debt sustainability? Basically, when you're doing what is called debt sustainability analysis that the Commission is doing, that in member state different type of institution are doing, you take a look at different factors, among which the future government revenue, the cost and maturity of debt, so the interest rate, the length of your debt, the maturity of the stock of debt, but also the difference between interest rate and growth rate, the fiscal risk. So as we discussed before, there are some climate-related fiscal risk, but fiscal risk is basically a type of spending which is not planned normally in the budget, but that can hit your budget at a later stage. And a budget planner is supposed to try to assess this type of risk and to imagine what can happen. For example, if a member state or state is give to some companies public guarantee, if there are some problem in the economy, a company could call this guarantee, and therefore it could be an additional cost for the public budget. But also, investors believe on the fact that a member state is able or not to pay its debt has a strong impact, because there's an impact, therefore, in the risk premium and therefore on the interest rate of the member states. And lastly, the type of debt holder. It make a difference if the one that holds your public debt is domestic or foreign investor. If it is domestic, if it's your own bank's own citizen, own central banks, it's not the same than if your debt is held outside of the EU, for example. So the Commission is doing debt sustainability analysis, but we have to recall that in any case, it's a probabilistic exercise subject to uncertainty. So basically, the fiscal framework is built on some thresholds. We all the economists know that a threshold can't define debt sustainability, that you have to take a look to other type of factor, that these factors are discussed and debated in debt sustainability analysis. The Commission is doing that each year, so we have all of this, but it's still not important enough in our fiscal framework. We give more weight to arbitrary threshold than to more clever debt sustainability analysis. And it's the point that we'll have to change in the future European fiscal framework. We will have to give more room to debt sustainability analysis and to not to have some sort of fetishism around a certain number. What's also important to understand is that we don't really have an issue with debt sustainability in Europe nowadays. And I will just show you two graphs that will help you to think about it. So the first one is this one, is about the evolution of long-term sovereign interest rate. And by long-term, we mean 10 years sovereign bonds. So it's based on European Central Bank database. And you can see it's the evolution of interest rate from 1993 to 2020 for France, Italy, Netherlands, Spain, Germany, Greece, Portugal, different euro area countries. What you can see on this graph is that in 1993, the long-term sovereign interest rate was between 7 and 13%, while nowadays is between a bit less than 0% and 3% for all member states. So we are in a period of historically low interest rates. There are many hypotheses on why. There are many very interesting reports by many economists from Harvard, from each and every university you can think of, about why we are here. You have the secular stagnation hypothesis, global saving glue. This can be explained by demographic change, by monetary policy, low inflation. Unfortunately, we don't really have the time to dig into this question here, but feel free to ask further question, or we can discuss that after the webinar. But just remind where we are today, it's here, and it's really historically low. And therefore, it has an impact on what we call the debt servicing cost. Debt servicing cost is basically the cost for a state to service its own stock of debt. So as you know, while a household has to repay both the principal and the interest rate, because an household is not eternal, and also all can't really roll over its debt. A state can, because it's eternal. So in general, states are not really fighting to reimburse the debt, they are rollovering the stock of debt. So when a debt arrives at maturity, they basically, each member state issue a new bonds to repay the principal. And so what's really matter for the state, it's the cost of interest. When you take this cost of interest and you take it on the whole stock of debt, you have the debt servicing cost. Back in 1995, servicing is stock of debt costs to any member state between 3.5% and 13% of its own GDP. Nowadays, servicing the stock of debt, even if it's a much higher debt stock, only costs between 0 and 3% of the GDP. So really today, debt is really not an issue for any member states. And there are many reasons to believe it won't be in the coming decades, which we really have to keep in mind if that we have other issues in front of us, among which climate change, among which decaying infrastructure, among which an aging Europe, and that the public investment will be required, and it's really with very low interest rates and very low debt servicing costs, it's really the moment to invest and not to focus too much on outdated and arbitrary debt to GDP thresholds. You will have more detail on this myth and all the 8 other myths in our fiscal mythology and mask report. This brings me to the last point, and thanks for your attention. I know it can be a bit dense in the morning. So the navigation. How to reform the European fiscal framework. As you probably all know, for the moment, the European fiscal rules are frozen. It's because member states and the Commission invoked the general escape clause that allow to put them on ice. So we are in this step now. Soon, the Commission is going to restart the European Economic Governance Review consultation, basically asking to academic, civil society, all stakeholders involved, what they think should change and how to change the European fiscal framework. So it's really the right moment to have this week of debates. And then we're going to arrive to the reform of the fiscal rule. To reform the fiscal rule in the European fiscal framework, you have three main options. The first one, the easiest one, is to tweak the SGP, Stability Growth Pact, interpretative guidance, and the non-legislative document. The second one is to reform the Stability Growth Pact in itself, secondary legislation. And the third one is to reform the European Treaty. So the first one, tweaking Stability Growth Pact, interpretative guidance, and non-legislative document.
Just a short warning on time, Ludovic. I think we need to wrap up soon, so we have a little bit of time for questions.
Okay, perfect. So on this interpretative guidance, you have some information on how to interpret different parts of the Stability Growth Pact, for example, the investment clause. And some people are thinking that you could just by tweaking this interpretative guidance, ease some unnecessarily restrictive condition of the investment clause. Other person think that we should clarify the procedure for the different escape clause, and other proposal, for example, for member and friends from Desernatzukunst, there are some proposal to change how we calculate output gap, basically saying that it's a good way to release some pressure and to allow for more spending and investment. But we think that while it could be highly useful, it won't be enough to fix problem. So the second option is reforming a Stability Growth Pact, which is for us really the main objective. Here, the most important part for us is to get rid of the debt reduction benchmark, which asks to cut your debt in excess of 60% by 1/20th per year. It would obviously break the recovery of countries like Italy, but many others too. So it would be really problematic if we reactivate the debt reduction benchmark in 1 or 2 years. And there is a strong discussion to move to country-specific debt pathway that would be based on debt sustainability analysis. So either to have this rule for everyone to reduce your debt with the same amount, same level, we would do a more concrete and complete analysis of the debt situation of a country. So we would look at the 6 factors we discussed before in the midsection, and see if one country has an issue. For example, they have a too high share of short-term debt. The country-specific debt pathway could be to reduce the short-term debt, but not the overall level of public debt, because there are no issue on that. So this would allow this direction to be more precise and to to have more clever rule. The second one is the investment clause. It's embedded in Stability Clause Pact. We could relax the conditionality right there and also create a green golden rule that would exclude climate-related investment and spending. Also, the Stability Convergence Program, which is basically the budgetary plan that member state has to submit to the Commission. It could be changed. We could say that it's not just about the quantity of spending, but that member state also should be more precise on the public spending quality, what they are spending on. And it could impact the transparency, the comparability among countries, the accountability about the spending quality. It's something that could be done. Also, the European semester could prioritize SDG-related investment in reform and not just monitor SDG and environmental trends. And the expenditure benchmark could receive a central role. It may be too technical to discuss it now. The last point, which is more difficult in long run, is to reform the European Treaty, where we could scrap or lax the 3% and 60% reference value, and where we could also better integrate sustainability imperative in the foundation of fiscal and socio-economic pillar. So the first one, it's a really an easy option. It's a technical formality. The second one is feasible via the ordinary legislative procedure, and normally the European Commission is going to launch this process. So it's really the right moment to engage with the Commission on that before their own proposal. And the art part is to reform the European Treaty via ordinary simplified revision procedure. But this required the unanimity, so it has not a lot of chance to happen anytime soon. So, question? Feel free if you have any.
Let us know if anything was unclear. We're sorry we overrun a little bit in terms of time, but if you have any questions, feel free to also, we're very happy to stay on a little bit longer to answer them if there was anything unclear or anything should be clarified or specified. You can use the raise your hand tool. You can write it in the Q&A or in the chat. Just let us know. Isabel is asking if that reforming the treaty is cumbersome, but reforming Protocol 12 requires only unanimity. Do we consider that feasible? What do you think, Ludovic?
I don't think it should be an objective in the short run, but something that should be kept in mind. If you agree that this threshold has are not economically sound, that have no intellectual basis, just a political choice done in 1992, it's something we should scrap one day or another, but it won't be done right now. So we shouldn't waste our energy trying to change this two number. We should try to circumvent them. And there are many ways to do that.
Thanks, Ludovic. Any other questions? If that is not the case, and maybe you feel a little bit overwhelmed by all the information, feel free to always come back to our website to look at the reports that Ludovic mentioned. Feel free to reach out to me or to Ludovic with any kind of questions. You find the contact information right there on the slide on our website as well. And of course, we will share the presentation after the webinar. And as a last reminder, please join our closing event tonight with Josef Stieglitz at 5 o'clock. I've posted a link in the chat for you to register. It would be really great to see many of you there. I think it will be really worth it to tune in. And if not, I thank you a lot for joining today. If you've joined any of the other events this week, thanks a lot. And please don't hesitate to reach out with any kind of questions. And have a really nice day. Thank you for joining, everybody. Thank you, Ludovic, for the presentation.
Thanks.